The gunshot tore through the Wyoming night, echoing across the vast empty plains. Rebecca Walker dove behind the rotting stump, her heart hammering against her ribs, the wound on her shoulder throbbing with each terrified breath. Blood seeped through her tattered dress, warm against her cold skin. She pressed her hand against it, willing the flow to stop. Behind her, hoofbeats pounded the hard earth, growing louder with each passing second. "You can run, Rebecca," a man's voice called smooth and cultured, despite its menacing tone. "But you belong to me. You've always belonged to me," clutching her small canvas bag with one hand and pressing against her wound with the other, she forced herself to her feet. The silver cross her mother had given her, the only remnant of a life before pain swung at her neck as she stumbled forward into the howling wind. Rain began to fall, first a gentle patter, then a driving deluge that turned the ground beneath her bare feet to treacherous mud. The storm might kill her, but it would also cover her tracks. As thunder crashed overhead, Rebecca sent a silent prayer heavenward. She hadn't prayed in years, not since William had branded his mark onto her flesh, but desperation has a way of rekindling even the faintest embers of faith. "Lord, if you're listening, I need shelter. I need safety. I need salvation." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the road ahead, and there, barely visible through the curtain of rain, stood a weathered church, its steeple pointing accusingly at the storm clouds above. Mason Hayes sank the shovel into the hard Wyoming soil, his movements mechanical, driven by a grief that had long since hardened into something colder and more permanent. The oak tree on the hill behind his property stood sentinel, its ancient branches creaking in the rising wind. It was a fitting place, he thought, to bury what remained of his hope. The small wooden box in his hand weighed almost nothing, just a simple wedding band and a lock of chestnut hair tied with blue ribbon. All he had allowed himself to keep of Eleanor. The rest, her clothes, her books, her jewelry, remained untouched in the room he had locked after her death. The room he never entered. The room the girls were forbidden to mention. He knelt beside the shallow hole, placing the box carefully inside. No prayer accompanied the gesture. Mason hadn't spoken to God since he'd found Eleanor in the barn 3 months ago, her body swinging gently from the center beam, her bare feet suspended above the hay-strewn floor. "I failed you," he whispered, the words barely audible above the rising wind. "I should have seen it coming, should have protected you." His calloused fingers lingered on the rough-hewn lid. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, a warning of the storm approaching from the west. Mason quickly covered the box with soil, tamping it down with the back of the shovel. No marker would identify this spot. Its location would live only in his memory, like so many other painful things. Standing, he surveyed the land that had belonged to the Hayes family for 3 generations. The cabin his grandfather had built, the barn his father had raised, the fences he himself had mended year after year. It should have been a legacy of pride. Now it felt like a prison of memories. In the deepening gloom, he could make out the silhouette of Ezekiel Morgan riding toward the house. The old man had fought alongside Mason's father in the war between the states and had appointed himself unofficial guardian of the Hayes family after Amos's death. Mason didn't want company tonight, but Ezekiel rarely concerned himself with what others wanted. With one last look at the unmarked grave, Mason shouldered the shovel and made his way down the hill. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as he reached the yard, cold messengers of the deluge to come. "You think you can hide here?" The woman's voice cracked like a whip. "Miss Walker, isn't it?" Rebecca stood dripping on the church porch, her clothes plastered to her thin frame, her wounded shoulder burning with each heartbeat. The woman before her, red-faced and scowling, broom clutched like a weapon, blocked the entrance to what should have been sanctuary. "Please," Rebecca whispered, her voice rough from disuse and fear. "I just need shelter until the storm passes. I'm injured." "We know who you are." The woman jabbed the broom toward her. "Word travels even in weather like this. You worked at Madame Catherine's place in Willow Creek." "I wasn't," Rebecca began, then stopped. What was the point? No one ever believed her. "I'll go when the rain lets up. You'll go now." The church door slammed shut, the sound lost in a crack of thunder. Rebecca stood motionless, uncertainty paralyzing her. The wound on her shoulder had stopped bleeding, but infection would set in soon without proper care. She had nowhere to go. The next town was 15 miles east, impossible to reach before nightfall. The wilderness stretched in every other direction, unforgiving and vast. And somewhere behind her, William was still searching. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the storm's roar. Rebecca pressed herself against the church wall, heart racing anew. Had he found her already? But the rider who materialized through the curtain of rain wasn't William. This man was broader, stronger looking, with a beard flecked with gray, and a long scar down his left cheek. He wore a duster coat against the rain, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He reined his horse to a stop, sharp blue eyes assessing her from beneath the hat's brim. "You got somewhere to be?" the man asked, his voice low, but carrying clearly through the storm. Rebecca shook her head slightly. "Someone waiting on you?" "No," she managed. The man shifted in his saddle, seeming to consider something. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied her with that penetrating gaze. Rebecca lowered her eyes, one hand instinctively rising to touch the silver cross at her throat. Her mother's cross, the last link to a time before her life had shattered. The simple gesture seemed to decide something for the rider. "I'm Mason Hayes," he said finally. "Got a ranch about 7 miles west of Silver Pine." Rebecca nodded once, uncertain why he was telling her this. "I've got 2 daughters," he continued. "Victoria's 7, Grace, is just turned 3. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "Their mother passed last winter." Another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, throwing the man's face into sharp relief. In that instant, Rebecca saw something beyond the hardness, a bone-deep weariness that resonated with her own. "I ain't looking for a wife," he said plainly, "and I don't have time for courtship. But my girls need someone who can cook, keep house, someone to remind them what a woman sounds like." The rain slackened slightly, allowing Rebecca to study him more clearly. His eyes weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They were simply assessing. "You look like you need a roof," he added, his gaze dropping briefly to the bloodstain on her shoulder. "And maybe a doctor. I need someone who won't steal, won't drink, and won't frighten my girls. That's all." Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands trembled against her small canvas bag. "You don't know me," she finally whispered. "I don't need to," Mason replied. "I've seen enough to know when someone's just trying to survive." Rebecca remained silent, weighing her options, though, in truth, she had none. The storm was worsening. Night was falling. Her wound needed attention. And this stranger was offering shelter. She was about to speak when Mason's attention fixed on something at her throat, the silver cross that had slipped from beneath her tattered shawl. For a moment, something shifted in his expression. A recognition, perhaps, or a memory. "My mother had one like that," he said, softer than before. Rebecca's fingers moved instinctively to the pendant. "It was my mother's, too," she said, the words coming unbidden. all I have left of her." Mason nodded once, as if this simple fact had confirmed something. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn woolen blanket, extending it toward her. "It's your choice," he said. "You can say no. We'll forget this happened." When Rebecca didn't move, he added, "But if you come, there'll be a fire waiting, a meal, a doctor for that shoulder, a bed with a roof over it. Nothing promised beyond that, but it'll be yours for as long as you earn it." Thunder cracked overhead. Rain began falling in earnest again. Rebecca took the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, its rough warmth the first comfort she'd felt in days. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll come." Mason nodded once, no smile, just acknowledgement. He extended his hand, helping her onto the horse, before mounting behind her. They rode off into the storm, two strangers bound not by choice or affection, but by necessity, and perhaps, though neither would admit it, the faintest glimmer of hope. "Hold still," Dr. Samuel Porter instructed, his liver-spotted hands surprisingly gentle as they cleaned Rebecca's wound. "Bullet just grazed you. Lucky." Rebecca sat at Mason's kitchen table, the borrowed blanket draped around her lower half, her torn dress pulled down just enough to expose the angry red furrow across her upper shoulder. The doctor, an elderly man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, had arrived minutes after they'd reached the ranch, summoned by Mason with a terseness that brooked no argument. "Who shot you, girl?" the doctor asked, applying a stinging antiseptic that made Rebecca hiss through clenched teeth. "It doesn't matter," she replied, eyes fixed on the rough wooden tabletop. Dr. Porter glanced at Mason, who stood near the fireplace, his back to the room. "Hayes," the doctor said, "this kind of wound means trouble. You sure you want to bring that to your door?" "My decision," Mason answered without turning. "Just fix her up." The doctor sighed, but continued his work cleaning and bandaging with practiced efficiency. "Keep it dry," he instructed Rebecca. "Change the dressing daily. Come see me in a week if you're still around." The last words carried clear skepticism. Rebecca didn't blame him. She looked every inch the drifter, the fugitive, exactly what she was. "Thank you," she said quietly, as he packed his medical bag. Dr. Porter nodded, then turned to Mason. "Girls asleep." "Ezekiel's with them upstairs," Mason replied. "Thought it best they not see this." "Smart," the doctor agreed. "They've seen enough already." He moved to the door, then paused, lowering his voice. "Mason, if this brings trouble—" "I can handle trouble." Mason cut him off. "Always have." When the doctor had gone, silence descended on the kitchen. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the simple room. Rain drummed steadily on the cedar-shake roof. Rebecca remained seated, uncertain what was expected of her now. Mason finally turned his expression unreadable in the firelight. "There's a room in the back," he said. "Used to be a sewing room. Clean sheets on the bed. You'll find a nightgown and some of Eleanor's old clothes in the trunk. Should fit well enough until we can get you proper things." Rebecca nodded, grateful beyond words for this simple kindness. "Your daughters, will they be frightened of me?" "Victoria's wary of everyone these days. Grace doesn't speak much. They'll adjust." He moved to a cabinet, withdrew a bottle, and poured a measure of amber liquid into a glass. "Drink this, for the pain." Rebecca accepted the whiskey, taking a small sip that burned all the way down. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Mason," he corrected. "No need for formalities. Not out here." She nodded again, taking another sip of the fiery liquid. "Tomorrow," Mason continued, "we'll establish routines, what you'll do where things are kept. For tonight, just rest." "I'm a good worker," Rebecca said quickly. "I can cook, clean, sew." Mason held up a hand, stopping her recitation. "Tomorrow," he repeated. "Tonight, you're wounded and exhausted. Rest is what you need." As if summoned by their voices, the floorboards above creaked, and moments later an old man descended the stairs. He was tall, whip-thin, with silver hair cropped close to his skull, and a weathered face that had seen more years than most. His sharp eyes took in Rebecca's bandaged shoulder and the whiskey glass in her hand without comment. "Girls are asleep," he reported to Mason. "Victoria had questions, but I told her they'd keep till morning." "Thanks, Ezekiel," Mason replied. "This is Rebecca Walker. She'll be helping with the girls. Rebecca Ezekiel Morgan. Neighbor. Old friend of my father's." Ezekiel studied her with an intensity that made Rebecca want to shrink into herself. "Walker," he repeated, as if testing the name. "From where?" "Most recently, Willow Creek," Rebecca answered cautiously. "Before that, various places." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Shot wounds fresh." "Hunting accident," Rebecca lied smoothly. "Wrong place, wrong time." A flicker of disbelief crossed the old man's face, but he didn't challenge her. Instead, he turned to Mason. "Storm's easing. I'll head back before the creek rises." "Stay," Mason offered. "Spare room's made up." "Better get back to my own place," Ezekiel declined. "Stock needs tending come morning." He retrieved his hat from a peg by the door, then gave Rebecca one last appraising look. "Hope you find what you're looking for, Miss Walker." After he'd gone, Mason showed Rebecca to the small back room. It was simple, but clean, with a narrow bed, a pine dresser, and a small window that looked out toward the hills. A patchwork quilt covered the bed, and a rag rug softened the wooden floor. "Washroom's down the hall," he said from the doorway. "Kitchen's always open. Girls wake at dawn." Rebecca set her small canvas bag on the bed. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Mason's expression remained stoic, but something in his eyes softened fractionally. "Get some rest," he repeated, then closed the door, leaving her alone. Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The events of the day of the past weeks crashed over her in a wave of exhaustion. She was safe, at least for the moment. Dry, warm. Tomorrow's problems could wait until tomorrow. Outside the small window, the storm continued to rage, wind and rain lashing against the glass. Inside, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca felt the faintest flicker of hope. She touched her mother's cross, offering a silent prayer of gratitude. "Thank you for shelter in the storm. Please let it last." Dawn arrived with golden fingers of light reaching through the small window, touching Rebecca's face with gentle warmth. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned the storm, Mason Hayes, the small room that was now hers. She sat up carefully, testing her injured shoulder. It ached, but the sharp pain had subsided. Moving quietly, she dressed in one of Eleanor Hayes's old dresses she'd found in the trunk, a simple blue cotton slightly faded but well made. It hung loose on her thin frame, but with the help of pins and a belt, she made it presentable. Her own clothes were beyond salvaging. The house was silent as she made her way to the kitchen. The fire had died to embers overnight, and Rebecca set about reviving it, working with practiced efficiency, despite her injury. By the time the flames were crackling merrily in the hearth, the coffee was brewing, filling the room with its rich aroma. "You're up early." Rebecca turned to find a small girl watching her from the kitchen doorway. She was perhaps 7, with wheat blonde hair and serious brown eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. She wore a simple dress, her hair neatly braided, clearly having dressed herself. Good morning, Rebecca greeted softly. You must be Victoria. The girl nodded her gaze, taking in Rebecca's appearance with unconcealed assessment. Papa said you'd be here. He said you're going to help. That's right. Our mother is dead, Victoria stated matter-of-factly, as if ensuring Rebecca understood this critical point. She got sick after Grace was born. I'm very sorry, Rebecca replied, hearing the genuine pain beneath the child's blunt words. It must be difficult without her. Victoria's expression didn't change, but her small shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. We're managing, she said, echoing what must have been her father's words. I take care of Grace. Papa takes care of us. And now I'm here to help, Rebecca added gently. Victoria studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, not quite acceptance, but acknowledgement. Do you know how to make flapjacks, Papa tries, but they always burn? The simple request, so normal amid the strangeness of the situation, made Rebecca smile. I do. Would you like to help? A hint of interest flickered in the child's serious eyes. I could show you where the flour is kept. By the time Mason came downstairs, Rebecca and Victoria had prepared a simple but hearty breakfast. The coffee was hot, the flapjacks golden, and bacon sizzled in the cast-iron skillet. Mason paused in the doorway, surprise evident in his expression as he took in the domestic scene. Morning, Papa, Victoria greeted. Miss Walker made breakfast. I helped. Mason's gaze moved to Rebecca, who stood by the stove, spatula in hand. You didn't have to start so soon, he said. Your shoulder is healing nicely, Rebecca finished for him. And I've never been one for idleness. A small sound from the stairway drew their attention. A younger child stood there, perhaps 3 years old, with dark hair that contrasted sharply with her startlingly blue eyes, her father's eyes. She clutched a rag doll missing one button eye, watching Rebecca with solemn curiosity. Grace, Mason said, his voice softening noticeably. Come meet Miss Walker. She'll be staying with us for a while. The little girl descended the last few steps, but didn't approach. She studied Rebecca intently, her gaze eventually fixing on the silver cross visible at Rebecca's throat. Something like recognition flickered in her young face. Mama, she whispered so softly, Rebecca wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Victoria hurried to her sister's side. No, Grace, she corrected gently. Mama's gone. Remember, this is Miss Walker. She's going to help take care of us. Grace didn't respond, just continued staring at Rebecca with those piercing blue eyes. Then, without warning, she crossed the room and took Rebecca's hand, tugging her toward the table where the food waited. Hungry, she said clearly, a word she used often. The simple interaction broke the tension. They settled around the table, an awkward makeshift family, sharing their first meal together. Mason ate quickly, complimenting the food with a nod, but offering little conversation. Victoria maintained her watchful assessment, while Grace seemed content simply to have food before her. When breakfast was finished, Mason rose. I'll be checking the north pasture today. Fences need mending after that storm. He glanced at Rebecca. You should rest that shoulder. I'll be fine, she assured him. I thought I'd learn the routine, get to know the girls a bit better. Mason nodded, seeming relieved by her practicality. Victoria knows where everything is kept. She can show you. He paused, then added, Doctor left some medicine for your wound. Make sure you use it. After he'd gone, Rebecca turned to the girls. Well, she said with a smile, shall we get started? The first day passed in a blur of new routines and cautious adjustments. Victoria proved to be an excellent guide, showing Rebecca the organization of the house with a seriousness that spoke of months spent assuming responsibilities far beyond her years. Grace followed them silently, clutching her doll, and occasionally reaching to touch Rebecca's dress, as if assuring herself this new person was real. The house itself was simple, but well-built, a two-story log structure with a stone fireplace that served as both heat source and cooking area. The main floor contained the kitchen, a sitting area with bookshelves built into the walls, and Rebecca's small room off the back hall. Upstairs were two bedrooms, one for the girls and one that remained firmly closed. No one mentioned this locked door, but Rebecca noticed how both girls' eyes slid past it, as if pretending it wasn't there. Eleanor's room, the shrine to a dead woman's memory. By evening, Rebecca had familiarized herself with the basic workings of the household, prepared a simple stew for supper, and begun to establish a tentative connection with Victoria through their shared tasks. Grace remained largely silent, but stayed close to Rebecca throughout the day, watching her every move with those observant blue eyes. After supper, as Rebecca cleared the dishes, Mason rose from the table. "Girls," he said, "time to get ready for bed. I'll be up shortly." "Could I help?" Rebecca offered. With their bedtime routine, Mason hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to sharing this responsibility. "If they're comfortable with it," he finally said, looking to his daughters. Victoria glanced between her father and Rebecca, her young face thoughtful. "Miss Walker could read to us," she suggested cautiously. "Papa always falls asleep before the good parts." A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "Fair enough," he conceded. "I'll check on you before you sleep." As the girls headed upstairs to prepare for bed, Rebecca finished cleaning the kitchen, her mind processing the day's events. This strange new situation, this broken family that had taken her in, felt both fragile and significant. She had no illusions about her position. She was here on Mason's charity to serve a practical purpose. And yet, there was something in the way Grace had taken her hand, in the cautious openness of Victoria's offer to have her read at bedtime, that suggested the possibility of something more. When she entered the girls' room, she found them already in their nightgowns, Victoria sitting primly on her bed, with a book in hand, Grace nestled in her small trundle bed with her doll. The room was simple, but clearly arranged with care, colorful quilts on the beds, a small bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, a rocking chair by the window. "What shall we read?" Rebecca asked, settling into the chair. Victoria held up a book of fairy tales, its cover worn with frequent handling. "This one. We're in the middle of Beauty and the Beast." Rebecca accepted the book, finding the marked page. "An excellent choice." As she read, her voice filling the small room with tales of enchantment and transformation, she noticed Grace's eyes growing heavy. Victoria, however, remained alert, hanging on every word. When the chapter ended, Victoria closed the book carefully. "Mama used to read to us every night," she said quietly, her usual composure slipping just enough to reveal the child beneath. "Before she got sick." Rebecca's heart ached for the girl's loss. "She sounds like a wonderful mother." "She was," Victoria agreed. "Until she wasn't." The simple, devastating assessment, so adult in its understanding, nearly brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. "Sometimes," she said gently, "people change in ways they can't control. It doesn't mean they stop loving us." Victoria looked down at her hands. She stopped looking at us. At the end, she'd stare out the window for hours. When I'd talk to her, it was like she couldn't hear me. Rebecca moved to sit beside Victoria on the bed, careful not to push too far too quickly. "That must have been very frightening for you." "Papa said it was the melancholy." Victoria continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "He said her mind was sick, not her body. But I think her heart was sick too. It forgot how to love us." "Oh, Victoria," Rebecca said softly, "I'm sure her heart never forgot. Sometimes our minds can get so clouded with sadness that we can't show our love, but that doesn't mean it isn't there." Victoria looked up, her young face a battlefield of doubt and hope. "Do you think she can see us now? Papa says that's nonsense, but Miss Reed says Mama's watching from heaven." Rebecca thought carefully before answering, aware of the weight her words might carry. "I believe that love doesn't end when someone dies," she said finally. "My mother passed when I was young, but I've always felt her presence in my life, guiding me, protecting me." She touched the silver cross at her throat. "That's what this reminds me of, that we're never truly alone." Grace, who Rebecca had thought asleep, suddenly sat up in her trundle bed. "Angel," she said, clearly pointing at Rebecca's necklace. "That's right, sweetheart." Rebecca smiled, surprised by the child's interjection. "Some people think of their loved ones as angels watching over them." Grace nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed something she'd long suspected. She lay back down, pulling her doll close, and closed her eyes once more. Victoria watched her sister, then turned back to Rebecca. "Grace doesn't talk much," she explained unnecessarily. "Not since Mama died." "She will when she's ready," Rebecca assured her. "Some hurts take time to heal." A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and Mason appeared in the doorway. "All set for sleep?" he asked, his deep voice gentled for his daughters. "Miss Walker read the beast's transformation," Victoria reported, "and we talked about Mama." A flicker of something pain, perhaps, or worry, crossed Mason's face. "Did you now?" "It's okay, Papa," Victoria said with surprising maturity. "Miss Walker understands about the melancholy." Mason's eyes moved to Rebecca, questioning. She met his gaze steadily, hoping he understood she'd been careful with his daughter's fragile emotions. "Time to sleep," he said, finally crossing to kiss first Victoria's forehead, then Grace's. "Dawn comes early." Rebecca rose from the bed, smoothing Victoria's quilt one last time. "Good night, little ones," she said softly. "Sweet dreams." As she followed Mason from the room, she heard Victoria's voice already heavy with approaching sleep. "Miss Walker, will you read again tomorrow night?" "If you like." Rebecca answered, warmth spreading through her chest at this small victory. "I think Grace would like it," Victoria said, her usual self-possession slipping just enough to reveal her own desire. "Then there will definitely be more stories." She closed the door quietly, turning to find Mason standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the single lamp. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The reading, I mean. That's not why you're here." "I know," Rebecca replied. "But stories are important to children. They help make sense of a world that often doesn't." Mason's jaw tightened slightly. "Just don't fill their heads with nonsense about angels and their mother watching from heaven. Life's hard enough without false hopes." "With all due respect," Rebecca said carefully, "hope isn't false just because it can't be seen or touched. Sometimes it's the only thing that gets us through the darkest nights." Something flickered in Mason's eyes, surprise, perhaps at her gentle challenge. But he didn't argue further. "Get some rest," he said instead. "Your shoulder needs healing." As he turned away, Rebecca noticed for the first time a small key hanging from the watch chain at his waist, the key she suspected to Eleanor's locked room. Such a small thing to guard such significant memories. Later that night, unable to sleep, Rebecca rose from her narrow bed and moved to the window. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the landscape. In the distance, she could see the outline of a small hill, where an old oak tree stood sentinel. Something about its silhouette struck her as familiar, though she couldn't place why. A movement caught her eye. A figure walking slowly along the fence line. Mason, she realized, restless in the night hours. He paused, looking up at the same moon. She watched his posture, conveying a solitude so profound it was almost tangible even at this distance. Rebecca pressed her hand against the cool glass, an unexpected sympathy rising within her. For all his gruff exterior and suspicious nature, Mason Hayes was, she suspected, a man drowning in grief, too proud to call for help, too stubborn to admit he was sinking. What had happened here? What darkness had descended on this household before her arrival? The questions circled in her mind like restless birds preventing sleep. She returned to bed, but instead of closing her eyes, she reached for her small canvas bag and withdrew her most precious possession, a tattered Bible that had belonged to her mother. Opening it to the flyleaf, she traced the inscription written in a flowing hand, "To my beloved daughter, Margaret Hayes. May this guide you through life's storms. Faith endures when all else fails. Mother Margaret Hayes." She had abandoned her mother's surname when she'd fled Ohio, taking Walker from a kindly woman who'd helped her escape. Now, by some strange twist of fate, she found herself beneath a Hayes roof, caring for Hayes' children. Coincidence, perhaps? But as her mother had often said, God doesn't deal in coincidences. Rebecca closed the Bible, tucking it safely back into her bag. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt something beyond mere survival stirring in her chest. Something that felt dangerously close to purpose. The days fell into a pattern. Rebecca rose first, tended the fire, prepared breakfast. Mason ate quickly before heading out to work the ranch. The girls helped with simple chores, Victoria quite capable for her age, Grace following her sister's lead in silent diligence. Evenings were quiet affairs, with Mason often retreating to the porch after supper, while Rebecca cleaned up and settled the girls for bed. On the fifth evening, as Rebecca knelt before the hearth, stirring a pot of stew, she became aware of Grace standing beside her, watching intently. "Hello, little one," she smiled. "Would you like to help?" Grace didn't speak, but she nodded, her solemn eyes fixed on Rebecca's silver cross, which had slipped out from her dress as she leaned forward. "This?" Rebecca asked, touching the pendant. "It was my mother's. She gave it to me when I was about your age." Grace reached out hesitantly, her small fingers touching the cross with gentle reverence. "Pretty," she whispered. "Thank you," Rebecca said, heart warming at this small communication. "It's very special to me. My mother said it would protect me through life's storms." Grace's brow furrowed slightly, as if considering this. "Storm," she repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, like the rain and thunder we had the night I came here," Rebecca explained. "But sometimes storms happen inside us, too, in our hearts, when we're sad or frightened." The little girl nodded with surprising understanding. "Mama had storms," she said softly. The simple observation, so profound from one so young, caught Rebecca off guard. "Yes," she agreed gently. "I think she did." "Papa, too," Grace added, her blue eyes wise beyond their years. "Inside storms." "You're very perceptive, Grace," Rebecca said, amazed by the child's insight. Grace didn't respond to the compliment, perhaps not understanding the word, but she stayed close to Rebecca as she finished preparing the meal. When Mason and Victoria came in from the barn, Grace was setting the table under Rebecca's guidance, carefully placing each spoon with intense concentration. "Grace is helping," Victoria announced, a note of surprise in her voice. Mason's eyes moved from his younger daughter to Rebecca, a question in his gaze. Rebecca smiled slightly, but said nothing, allowing Grace's actions to speak for themselves. Something shifted in Mason's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. "Good job, little one," he said, ruffling Grace's dark hair gently. That night, after the girls were tucked in bed and Rebecca had read another chapter from their book of fairy tales, she found Mason on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands, despite the late hour. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. He nodded, and Rebecca settled into it, drawing her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "Grace helped with supper," Mason observed after a moment. "She did," Rebecca agreed. "She's coming out of her shell little by little. She hasn't helped with anything since—" He trailed off, then continued more quietly. "Since Eleanor. Children are resilient," Rebecca said. "With patience and love they heal." Mason took a sip of his coffee, his profile strong against the starlit backdrop. "Victoria told me you discussed Eleanor with them." Rebecca tensed slightly, wondering if she'd overstepped. Victoria had questions. I tried to answer them honestly but gently. "What did you tell her?" "That sometimes people change in ways they can't control, but that doesn't mean they stop loving their families." Rebecca hesitated, then added, "I also said I believe love continues even after death." Mason's jaw tightened. "You believe that after everything you've clearly been through?" The personal question, the first he'd asked about her past, surprised her. "I do," she answered honestly. "It's what has kept me going through difficult times." He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant howl of a coyote and the soft creak of the porch swing stirring in the breeze. "I found her in the barn," he finally said, his voice so low Rebecca had to strain to hear. 3 months ago, she'd hanged herself from the center beam." Rebecca's breath caught at the stark image his words conjured. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Victoria saw her first." Mason continued, each word seemingly dragged from some deep wounded place. "Came running to get me screaming. By the time I got there, Grace was just standing there staring up at her mother's body. Hasn't spoken more than a word or two at a time since." The horror of it, a child witnessing such a scene, made Rebecca's heart constrict painfully. "Those poor babies," she murmured. Eleanor had been unwell since Grace's birth, Mason said, staring into the darkness beyond the porch. "The doctor called it melancholia. Said it would pass. It didn't." He took another swallow of coffee, though Rebecca suspected it had gone cold. "The strange thing was, she seemed better that last week. Got out of bed, dressed herself, even smiled a little. I thought we'd turned a corner." "That happens sometimes," Rebecca said gently. "When someone has made the decision to end their life, there's a kind of peace that comes over them. The struggle is over in their minds." Mason turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You sound like you've seen it before." Rebecca nodded, her hand rising unconsciously to her throat where her cross lay. "My mother," she admitted. "She suffered something similar after my baby brother was stillborn. One day she seemed suddenly better, smiling, singing even. The next morning, my father found her—" She swallowed hard. "Found her with her wrists cut in the bathtub." "How old were you?" 12. Rebecca answered, the memories still sharp despite the years. Mason's face softened with something like recognition. "Same age I was when I lost my mother. Different circumstances, but the same emptiness afterward." This small shared confidence, this common ground of childhood grief, created a momentary bridge between them. For a breath, they were not employer and employee, not strangers thrown together by circumstance, but simply two souls who understood a specific kind of pain. "Your girls are fortunate," Rebecca said after a moment. "They have you, and you're fighting for them even through your own grief." Mason looked away, the moment of connection receding. "I'm not doing enough," he said flatly. "You saw how they were when you arrived. Victoria trying to be the woman of the house at 7. Grace not speaking. Me gone from dawn till dusk, because I can't bear to be in that house with all its ghosts." "You're doing the best you can," Rebecca countered. "And now they have me too. We'll help them heal together." Mason didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had regained its usual reserve. "It's late. You should rest." Rebecca recognized the dismissal, but felt compelled to ask one more question. "The locked room upstairs that was Eleanor's," Mason stiffened visibly. "We don't discuss that room." "I understand," Rebecca said gently. "I was just curious." "Curiosity isn't part of your duties here," he replied, his tone sharper than before. "Some doors are locked for a reason." Rebecca nodded, rising from her chair. "Good night, Mason." As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Rebecca." She turned surprised by his use of her given name. "Thank you," he said simply, "for what you're doing for the girls." The words were grudging, perhaps, but sincere. Rebecca smiled slightly. "You're welcome." Inside, as she prepared for bed, Rebecca found her thoughts returning to the locked room and all it represented. What secrets did it hold? What memories were preserved behind that closed door? And why did Mason guard it so zealously, even as he clearly struggled with his grief? Questions for another day, she decided slipping beneath the patchwork quilt. For now, she would focus on the living, on Victoria's cautious trust, on Grace's tentative emergence from silence, on the household slowly finding its rhythm with her presence. The rest would reveal itself in time. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 10 days after Rebecca's arrival at the Hayes Ranch. She was cleaning the upstairs hallway, a task she'd been putting off due to its proximity to Eleanor's room. The locked door remained a silent reminder of the tragedy that had shaped this household, and Rebecca found herself avoiding it when possible. As she worked her way down the hall, however, something caught her eye. A thin sliver of wood protruding slightly from the wainscoting near the floor, just a few feet from Eleanor's door. Curious Rebecca knelt, examining what appeared to be a loose panel. When she pressed it, the wood shifted inward, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Heart quickening, Rebecca reached inside. Her fingers touched something smooth fabric. She realized, withdrawing a handkerchief. It was fine linen, yellowed with age, embroidered with the initials R.M. in elegant blue stitching. R.M., not Eleanor Hayes, whose maiden name Rebecca had learned from Victoria, was Caldwell, who was R.M., and why was their handkerchief hidden in a secret compartment near Eleanor's room? Before she could ponder this further, a small voice broke the silence. "Angel." Rebecca started, nearly dropping the handkerchief. Grace stood at the top of the stairs, watching her with those solemn blue eyes. "Grace," she said softly, quickly tucking the handkerchief into her apron pocket. "Did you say something, sweetheart?" The little girl approached her rag doll clutched tightly in one arm. She reached out with her free hand and touched Rebecca's cheek gently. "Angel," she repeated the word clear, despite her usual reticence. Rebecca's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "Do you mean my necklace?" she asked, touching the silver cross. Grace shook her head, then placed her small hand directly over Rebecca's heart. "You," she said simply. "Angel watching." The simple declaration struck Rebecca with surprising force. This child who had witnessed such sadness at such a tender age saw something worthy in Rebecca, something protective, perhaps even holy. "Oh, Grace," Rebecca murmured, opening her arms. To her amazement, the little girl stepped into her embrace, small body relaxing against Rebecca's chest. For a long moment, they stayed like that, Rebecca's hand gently stroking the child's dark hair. When they finally separated, Grace's expression had softened some of her perpetual solemnity, giving way to something closer to peace. "Would you like to hear a special story tonight?" Rebecca asked, "about angels who watch over little girls." Grace nodded eagerly, more animation in her face than Rebecca had yet seen. "Then that's what we'll do," Rebecca promised. "Our secret story just for you." Grace smiled a real smile that transformed her solemn little face and squeezed Rebecca's hand before turning and heading back downstairs, her doll swinging at her side. Neither of them noticed Mason standing in the shadows at the bottom of the stairs, watching this exchange with an expression of mingled wonder and uncertainty. By the time Rebecca looked up, he had silently retreated, unwilling to interrupt the fragile moment of connection. That night, after the girls were asleep, Rebecca carefully examined the handkerchief by candlelight. It was old, but had once been expensive, the kind carried by ladies of quality. The embroidery was expert work, the thread still vibrant despite its age. R.M. The initials nagged at her familiar somehow, though she couldn't place why. She tucked it beneath her pillow, resolving to return it to its hiding place tomorrow. Whatever secrets it represented, they weren't hers to uncover. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this small scrap of fabric represented some piece of the puzzle that was the Hayes family, a clue to the shadows that haunted this household. Outside her window, the moon rose over the distant hills, illuminating the old oak tree on its solitary rise. In its silver light, the landscape seemed both beautiful and melancholy, much like the family whose roof now sheltered her. Rebecca touched the cross at her throat, remembering Grace's words. "You, angel watching." Perhaps that was enough for now, to watch, to care, to slowly heal the wounds time had yet to mend. And perhaps in doing so, she might find healing for her own scars as well. Ezekiel Morgan arrived early the next morning, his weathered wagon loaded with fence posts and wire. Rebecca was kneading bread dough when she heard his distinctive knock. 3 sharp raps, followed by a pause, then 2 more. "Morning, Miss Walker," he greeted when she opened the door, hat in hand. His sharp eyes took in her flour-dusted apron and the streak of it she'd undoubtedly smeared across her cheek. "Hayes around. He's checking the north pasture," Rebecca replied. "Said he'd be back by noon." Ezekiel nodded, glancing past her into the house. "Girls up yet. Victoria's helping with the wash. Grace is collecting eggs." Something like approval flickered across the old man's face. "Place runs smoother with a woman's hand," he observed. "Been a long while since that was true." It was perhaps the closest thing to a compliment Ezekiel had offered since her arrival. Rebecca found herself unexpectedly pleased by his acknowledgement. "I've just put coffee on," she offered. "Would you like some while you wait?" Ezekiel hesitated, then nodded. "Obliged." She led him to the kitchen where the wood stove radiated welcome heat against the morning chill. As she poured the coffee, Rebecca noticed Ezekiel studying her with particular attention, his gaze lingering on the silver cross visible at her throat. "That's a fine piece," he remarked, accepting the steaming mug. "Family heirloom." Rebecca's hand rose to touch the pendant. "My mother's," she confirmed. "The only thing of hers I kept." "Mind if I see it?" The request seemed odd, but Rebecca saw no reason to refuse. She unclasped the chain and handed him the cross. Ezekiel examined it carefully, turning it over in his gnarled fingers. On the back, Rebecca knew were the initials M.M.H. Her mother's name had been Margaret Hayes, though Rebecca had no memory of her father and had taken her mother's maiden name Walker after fleeing her husband. "Hayes," Ezekiel murmured, running his thumb over the engraved letters. "Interesting coincidence." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "Hayes is a common name," she said, striving for casualness. Perhaps, Ezekiel conceded, returning the cross. Though coincidence isn't something I've ever put much stock in. He sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim of the mug. You remind me of someone, Miss Walker. Oh, Rebecca busied herself with the bread dough, avoiding his penetrating gaze. Mason's mother, Ezekiel said. Rose, something in the eyes, the way you move. He set down his mug. She was Amos Hayes's second wife. His first died young, leaving him with a daughter. Rose raised that girl as her own alongside Mason. Rebecca's hands stilled in the dough. I didn't realize Mason had a sister. Half-sister, Ezekiel corrected. Disappeared years ago after a bad marriage. Rose was devastated. Died not long after consumption, they said, but I always thought it was heartbreak. Rebecca absorbed this information, something stirring at the edges of her memory. What was her name? The sister. Margaret, Ezekiel replied, watching Rebecca's face carefully. Margaret Hayes, though she may have taken her husband's name, Watson, I believe it was. The air seemed suddenly thin in the kitchen. Margaret Hayes Watson, MHW, the initials on her mother's cross. The mother who had committed suicide when Rebecca was 12. The mother whose Bible Rebecca carried, inscribed to Margaret Hayes. Could Mason Hayes be her uncle? Before she could process this possibility, the kitchen door opened and Victoria entered with a basket of wet laundry. Mr. Morgan, the girl exclaimed, her usual reserve giving way to genuine pleasure. Did you bring the carved animals you promised? Ezekiel's demeanor transformed instantly, his stern features softening into a smile. Can't fool you, can I, Miss Victoria? He reached into his pocket and produced a small wooden figure, a horse intricately carved and polished to a soft sheen. For your collection. Victoria accepted the gift with unusual enthusiasm. It's beautiful. Wait until Grace sees. As Victoria hurried to find her sister, Ezekiel turned back to Rebecca, his expression serious once more. Some truths are best revealed slowly, Miss Walker, he said quietly, especially when they involve old wounds. Rebecca nodded, understanding the wisdom in his caution. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Ezekiel, he corrected, rising from his chair. If your family, and I suspect you might be, then we're past formalities. The simple statement, with its conditional acceptance, warmed Rebecca unexpectedly. Then, thank you, Ezekiel. He nodded once, then reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object. This might interest you, he said, placing an old pocket watch on the table between them. It was silver tarnished with age, its case inscribed with an intricate design of oak leaves. Open it, Ezekiel instructed. Rebecca carefully lifted the watch and pressed the catch. Inside, the clock face had long since stopped, its hands frozen at 4:17. But it was the inscription engraved on the inner lid that caught her attention, faith through the storm. It was Amos Hayes's, Ezekiel explained, given to him by his father and to him by his family motto of sorts. Rebecca traced the inscription with her fingertip, a strange sense of recognition washing over her. Her mother had often repeated those exact words during difficult times, faith through the storm, Rebecca. It's what sees us through. Mason should have it, Ezekiel continued, but he refuses. Says he has no use for faith anymore. Rebecca closed the watch, gently returning it to the old man. Not since Eleanor, she guessed. Ezekiel nodded, pocketing the timepiece. Something broke in him that day. Not just grief, plenty of men survive that. It was like his belief in anything good just died with her. He paused, his weathered face grave. I've known that boy since he was born. Watched him grow, marry, have children of his own. Never seen him as lost as he's been these past months. He loves his daughters, Rebecca observed. That's something good he still believes in. Yes, Ezekiel agreed, but love tangled with fear is a dangerous thing. Makes a man build walls, keep secrets, push away those who might help. He fixed Rebecca with a penetrating gaze. There's more to Eleanor's death than Mason has told anyone. Something that haunts him, keeps him prowling the property at night with a rifle. Rebecca's unease deepened. What do you mean? Ezekiel glanced toward the door, ensuring they were still alone. I mean, he said, lowering his voice, that Mason doesn't believe his wife took her own life, not entirely. You think someone helped her? The implication was horrifying. I think, Ezekiel said carefully, that Eleanor knew something dangerous, something that made certain people nervous. And I think Mason suspects that whatever drove her to that barn wasn't just the melancholy. Before Rebecca could press for more details, the sound of hoofbeats announced Mason's return. Ezekiel straightened, the moment of confidence clearly over. Remember what I said, he murmured, as Mason's boots sounded on the porch steps. Some truths are best revealed slowly, and some doors once opened can't be closed again. The cryptic warning hung in the air as Mason entered, nodding to them both before announcing that the fence posts could be unloaded by the north pasture. Ezekiel rose, the conversation shifting to practical matters of ranch work. Rebecca returned to her bread dough mind, churning with new questions. If she truly was Mason's niece, his sister, Margaret's daughter, how and when should she reveal this? And what did Ezekiel mean about Eleanor's death not being entirely suicide? What secrets haunted this family she had so unexpectedly joined? Outside, Mason and Ezekiel loaded into the wagon, their voices fading as they headed toward the north pasture. Inside, Rebecca shaped the bread into loaves, her hands working automatically while her thoughts raced ahead. One thing was clear: the Hayes family harbored secrets deeper than she had imagined. And somehow, whether by chance or providence, her own fate had become entangled with theirs. Faith through the storm, the watch had read, her mother's words echoing across the years. She would need that faith in the days to come. The storm, she suspected, was only beginning. You're Mason's blood kin, whether he knows it yet or not. Ezekiel's weathered hand closed around his coffee mug as he studied Rebecca across the kitchen table. Morning light filtered through the curtains, casting dappled patterns on the worn wood between them. The girls were outside gathering eggs, their voices occasionally drifting through the open window. How long have you known? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Suspected since I first laid eyes on you, Ezekiel replied. You have Rose's eyes, same as your mother did. He gestured toward the silver cross at her throat. That confirmed it, recognized it as Margaret's right away. I gave it to her on her 16th birthday. Rebecca's fingers instinctively rose to touch the pendant. You knew my mother that well. Course I did. Ezekiel said, something softening in his craggy features. Rose Morgan Hayes was my sister, which makes me Mason's uncle, and yours too, in a manner of speaking. The revelation struck Rebecca like a physical blow. Your sister? But I thought you were just an old friend of the family. Easier that way sometimes, Ezekiel admitted. After Rose died, Amos, that's Mason's father, and I had a falling out. Took years to mend that fence. He sipped his coffee, eyes distant with memory. When Margaret ran off with that Watson fellow, it nearly broke Rose. She knew he was no good, could see it plain as day. But your mother was headstrong, convinced she was in love. She was 18, Rebecca said softly. Hardly more than a child. Ezekiel nodded grimly. By the time I tracked them to Ohio, you'd already been born, and Margaret, well, she wasn't the same girl who'd left Wyoming. Something in her had dimmed. That man had started his work on her spirit. Rebecca swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat. She took her life when I was 12. That what William Watson told you? Ezekiel's sharp gaze fixed on her face. Yes, Rebecca faltered. There was a note in her handwriting. A man like William Watson could make a woman write most anything. Ezekiel observed his voice flat. Never believed it was suicide. Not for a minute. The implication hung in the air between them, too terrible to voice aloud. Rebecca's mind reeled with the possibility that her mother's death, like Eleanor's, might have been something other than what it seemed. "Does Mason know any of this?" she asked, desperate to shift the conversation away from such painful ground. "That I'm his niece," Ezekiel shook his head. "Not my place to tell him. That's your truth to share when you're ready." He set down his mug and leaned forward. "But you should know this family's cursed with secrets, Rebecca. Secrets that kill. First Margaret, then Eleanor, and now this business with Richardson sniffing around town." Richardson. The unfamiliar name caught Rebecca's attention. Ezekiel's expression darkened. Thomas Richardson. Calls himself James Walton now. Slick fellow in town asking questions about the Hayes family. Claims to be from Boston, interested in railroad investments. A chill ran through Rebecca as she recalled Mason's warning about strangers. "Is he dangerous?" "As a rattlesnake in a nursery," Ezekiel confirmed grimly. "He worked for the bank in Denver where Eleanor uncovered some crooked dealings before she and Mason fled here. Word is he's cleaned up messes for powerful men before permanent-like." Rebecca's blood ran cold. "You think he had something to do with Eleanor's death?" "Mason does," Ezekiel replied. "Why, he keeps that rifle loaded and sleeps with one eye open." He glanced toward the window, ensuring the girls were still out of earshot. "Eleanor was scared in those final days. Told Mason someone from Denver had found them. 3 days later, she was hanging from a rafter in the barn." "Dear God," Rebecca whispered, the horror of it washing over her anew. "Mason found her." Ezekiel continued, his voice dropping lower. "But Victoria saw her first. Came running to get her pa, screaming fit to wake the dead. By the time Mason got there, Grace was just standing there staring up at her mama's body. Hasn't spoken more than a word or two at a time since." The image of a child witnessing such a scene made Rebecca's heart constrict painfully. "Those poor babies," she murmured. Ezekiel nodded solemnly. "Which is why I'm telling you all this. Those girls need protecting. Mason needs someone he can trust. And with Richardson in town," he let the sentence hang unfinished. "Why are you so sure you can trust me?" Rebecca asked, voicing the question that had been troubling her. "You barely know me." A ghost of a smile crossed Ezekiel's weathered face. "Been watching you longer than you think. Tracked you to Willow Creek after you escaped. That nephew of Watson's kept an eye on you there. Would have stepped in sooner, but you seem to be managing." Rebecca stared at him, stunned. "You've been following me?" "Keeping tabs," Ezekiel corrected. "Made a promise to Rose on her deathbed that I'd look after her family. Failed Margaret. Wasn't going to fail her daughter, too." He rose from the table, his joints creaking audibly. "Speaking of promises, I've got fence posts to deliver. Tell Mason I'll be back tomorrow with that wire he ordered." As he reached the door, he paused and turned back. "One more thing. That handkerchief you found with the RM initials," Rebecca's surprise must have shown on her face. "Yes, I know about that too," Ezekiel said with a hint of amusement. "Not much happens in this house that I don't eventually learn about. Those initials stood for Rose Morgan, my sister, Mason's mother. She gave it to Eleanor as a wedding gift. Something old, she called it." With that parting revelation, he left the door closing softly behind him. Rebecca remained at the table, mind whirling with all she'd learned. She was part of this family by blood, niece to Mason, great-niece to Ezekiel. The knowledge brought both comfort and complication. When should she tell Mason? Would it change how he viewed her presence in his home? And more urgently, what of this? Thomas Richardson, now calling himself James Walton. If he'd had a hand in Eleanor's death, could the entire Hayes family be in danger? The sound of the girls returning with their basket of eggs pulled Rebecca from her troubled thoughts. There would be time for such questions later. For now, there were children to care for, a household to maintain, and the growing certainty that her presence in this family was no mere coincidence, but something approaching destiny. Rebecca's first trip to Silver Pine came 2 weeks after her arrival at the Hayes Ranch. Her shoulder had healed enough for the journey, and Mason, reluctantly acknowledging the need for supplies, had finally agreed she could accompany Victoria into town. The little girl would ride her pony, a small dun mare named Penny, while Rebecca would take the gentle mule Mason had been training her on. "Remember what I told you," Mason instructed as he helped Rebecca adjust the saddle. "Keep to yourself. Hollister's store is on the main street, can't miss it. Get what's on the list and come straight back." Rebecca nodded, trying to hide her nervousness about riding into town. Her previous experiences with small settlements had taught her to expect suspicion whispers and sometimes outright hostility. "And if anyone asks," Mason continued, lowering his voice so Victoria couldn't hear from where she was brushing Penny, "you're a distant cousin helping with the girls. Nothing more, nothing less." "A cousin," Rebecca repeated, understanding his desire to protect his family's reputation. "Of course." Mason's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Be careful," he said, the words carrying more weight than their simple meaning suggested. "There have been strangers in town asking questions." "Richardson," Rebecca guessed, recalling Ezekiel's warning. Mason's eyes narrowed. "Ezekiel told you." It wasn't a question. "Some," Rebecca acknowledged. "Enough to know I should be wary." Mason studied her face, seeming to debate how much more to share. "If you see a well-dressed man with blue eyes," he finally said, "stay clear of him. Don't engage, don't answer questions. Just finish your business and come home." "I understand," Rebecca assured him, touched by his concern despite the gravity of the warning. They set out in the crisp morning air, Victoria riding proudly ahead, Rebecca following on the mule. The journey to Silver Pine would take about an hour at their leisurely pace, following a winding trail that eventually joined the main road into town. "Papa doesn't go to town much anymore," Victoria confided as they rode. "Not since Mama died." "It must be difficult for him," Rebecca replied carefully. Victoria nodded, her young face serious. "People look at him differently now. They whisper. I hear them sometimes." She straightened in her saddle. "But I pretend I don't. Miss Reed says that's dignified." "Miss Reed sounds wise," Rebecca observed. "Is she your teacher?" "She was," Victoria confirmed. "Before—" She trailed off, then continued with forced brightness. "But I'm going back to school next week. Papa said so." "That's wonderful," Rebecca smiled. "You must be excited." "I am," Victoria agreed. "But I worry about Grace. She's not used to being without me during the day." The mature concern in the child's voice touched Rebecca deeply. At 7, Victoria carried burdens no child should bear, worrying about her sister, managing her father's moods, navigating a town full of gossip. "Grace will be fine," Rebecca assured her. "She and I will keep each other company, and we'll be waiting when you come home each day." As they approached Silver Pine, Rebecca's apprehension returned. The town was larger than she'd expected, a main street lined with wooden buildings, side streets branching off where homes and smaller businesses clustered. The white steeple of a church rose at one end, while a saloon dominated the other. Between them lay the expected establishment's general store, blacksmith, sheriff's office, and a small schoolhouse. They hitched their mounts outside Hollister's general store, Rebecca helping Victoria down before tying the animals securely. The bell jingled as they entered, announcing their arrival to the handful of customers already inside. The proprietor, a heavy-set man with mutton-chop whiskers, looked up from his ledger. "Well, if it isn't Miss Victoria," he said, his tone warming. "Haven't seen you in town for a spell." "Hello, Mr. Hollister," Victoria replied politely. "We need supplies. I have Papa's list." Hollister's gaze shifted to Rebecca, curiosity evident. "And who might you be?" Before Rebecca could answer, Victoria cut in, "This is Miss Walker. She's our cousin. She's helping with Grace while I go back to school." Rebecca was impressed by how smoothly Victoria delivered the prepared story. The child met her gaze briefly, a hint of complicity in her brown eyes. "Well, any relation of the Hayes family is welcome here," Hollister said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by the explanation. "Let's see that list, then." As he began collecting their items, Rebecca and Victoria browsed the store's narrow aisles. Rebecca paused at a display of hair combs, simple wooden ones with carved designs. Her own comb had broken during her flight from William, leaving her to manage her thick hair with just her fingers. Victoria noticed her interest and reached into the small purse tied at her waist, withdrawing a coin. "I have my own money," she said proudly. "Papa gives me an allowance for helping with the chickens. I could buy it for you." The gesture touched Rebecca deeply. "That's very kind of you," she said softly, "but perhaps we should save your money for something more important." Victoria shook her head firmly. "Papa says small kindnesses matter most." She handed the coin to Rebecca. "Please, I want to." Unable to refuse the earnest offer, Rebecca accepted the coin with a smile. "Thank you, Victoria. I'll treasure it." The store bell jingled again. A woman entered, dressed in a severe black dress with a high collar, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. Her sharp eyes landed immediately on Victoria, then narrowed with undisguised suspicion as they moved to Rebecca. "Victoria Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What a pleasant surprise." "Hello, Miss Reed," Victoria replied, her earlier confidence diminishing slightly. "We're getting supplies." "So I see," Miss Reed said, gaze still fixed on Rebecca. "And who is this?" Victoria repeated their prepared explanation about Rebecca being a cousin, which Miss Reed received with obvious skepticism. "I wasn't aware Mason had any extended family in the area," she observed coolly. "How convenient that you've arrived just when he needed help." The implication was clear and deliberately provocative. Rebecca maintained her composure, meeting the woman's gaze steadily. "Family often comes together in times of need, Miss Reed. I'm grateful for the opportunity to help my cousins during this difficult period." Miss Reed's mouth pinched into a thin line. "Indeed." She turned to Victoria, her expression softening marginally. "The new term starts Monday. I expect to see you in class, bright and early." "Yes, Miss Reed." Victoria nodded obediently. After the teacher had moved to the counter to place her own order, Victoria whispered to Rebecca, "Miss Reed doesn't like you." "Oh, she's concerned for you," Rebecca corrected gently. "That's not the same as disliking me." "She was Mama's friend," Victoria explained. "But she and Papa argue now. She thinks something bad happened to Mama, something Papa isn't telling." Rebecca absorbed this information with growing unease. "What do you mean, something bad?" Victoria shrugged, her young face troubled. I don't know exactly. I heard them fighting once. Miss Reed said Eleanor would never have done that to her children not willingly. And Papa got very angry and told her to leave. The implication sent a chill through Rebecca. Could the schoolteacher share Mason's suspicions about Eleanor's death not being suicide? Before she could pursue this line of thought, Rebecca felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She turned slowly, scanning the store, and caught a glimpse of a man standing in the shadowed corner near the dry goods. He was well dressed in a manner that bespoke Eastern wealth, his dark suit immaculate despite the dusty frontier surroundings. But it was his eyes that captured Rebecca's attention, a penetrating blue that seemed to cut through the dimness, studying her with unnerving intensity. When their gazes met, the man smiled a cold, calculated expression that never reached those blue eyes. He stepped forward, emerging from the shadows with the smooth grace of a predator. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure," he said, his cultured voice carrying easily across the store. "James Walton recently arrived from Boston." He extended a gloved hand toward Rebecca. "And you are—" Rebecca's instincts screamed danger. This must be the man Mason had warned her about, Thomas Richardson, now calling himself Walton. His eyes, those unsettling blue eyes, seemed disturbingly familiar, though she couldn't place why. "Rebecca Walker," she replied, not taking the offered hand. "Excuse us, but we need to complete our purchases." "Walker," he repeated, as if tasting the name. His gaze flicked briefly to Victoria, then back to Rebecca. "A relative of the Hayes family, I understand. How fortunate for Mason to discover previously unknown family in his time of need." The subtle emphasis on previously unknown carried clear skepticism. Before Rebecca could respond, Victoria stepped forward, her small chin lifted in defiance. "Miss Walker is our cousin," she stated firmly, "and Papa says we shouldn't talk to strangers, especially ones who ask too many questions." A flash of something anger, perhaps, or surprise at being challenged by a child, crossed Walton's face before his smooth mask returned. He laughed, the sound hollow and practiced. "Wise advice from your father, Miss Victoria. Though I hope we won't remain strangers for long. I have business propositions that might interest Mason considerably." "I'll be sure to mention it to him," Rebecca said, placing a protective hand on Victoria's shoulder and steering her toward the counter where Hollister had assembled their supplies. Walton didn't follow, but Rebecca could feel his gaze tracking their movements as they completed their transaction and prepared to leave. When they stepped outside, she was relieved to find the street busy with the normal activities of a small town at midday, enough people to discourage any further unwelcome approaches. As they mounted their animals for the return journey, Rebecca cast one final glance toward the store. Walton stood in the doorway, watching them with that same calculating intensity. He raised his hand in a mock salute when he saw her looking, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I don't like him," Victoria said quietly as they rode away. "Neither do I," Rebecca admitted, urging her mule to a slightly faster pace. The sooner they were back at the ranch, the better. They had traveled perhaps half a mile when Rebecca noticed dust rising on the road behind them, a single rider moving fast. Her heart rate quickened. "Victoria," she said calmly, "let's take the creek path." The little girl glanced back, her eyes widening at the approaching rider. Without question, she guided her pony toward a narrow trail that branched off the main road, descending toward the willow-lined creek that wound its way through the countryside. The path was rougher, but offered the advantage of covered dense trees and undergrowth that would conceal them from the main road. They followed it for several minutes, the sounds of flowing water growing louder as they approached the creek. "Should we cross?" Victoria asked, clearly, understanding the gravity of the situation despite Rebecca's attempt to remain calm. Rebecca considered their options, The creek wasn't deep at this point, easily fordable by their mounts. On the other side, the land rose toward a wooded ridge that would eventually lead back to Hayes' property from the north. Yes, she decided. Let's cross and take the high trail home. They urged their animals into the shallow water, the cool current swirling around the animals' legs as they picked their way across the rocky streambed. Just as they reached the opposite bank, the unmistakable sound of another horse splashing into the water behind them made Rebecca turn. Walton sat astride his black stallion at the creek's edge, observing them with that same unnerving calm. "Ladies," he called, his voice carrying easily over the burbling water. "What a charming detour. Mind if I join you?" Rebecca's mouth went dry. "Victoria," she said quietly, "when we reach the bank, I want you to ride ahead. Follow the trail through the trees, and don't stop until you reach the ranch. Find your father." Victoria's face had gone pale, but she nodded, her young features set with determination. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Rebecca assured her, though uncertainty gnawed at her. "Go straight home. Don't look back." As their animals scrambled up the muddy bank, Victoria immediately urged Penny forward, the little mare responding admirably to her young rider's command. Within moments, they had disappeared into the trees, heading toward the safety of home. Rebecca turned to face Walton, who had now guided his horse halfway across the creek. "Mr. Walton," she called, forcing steel into her voice, "I think you've mistaken our path for a public thoroughfare. This is private property, Hayes land." Walton smiled, continuing his unhurried approach. "Is it? How careless of me. Though I must say, Miss Walker, your protective instincts are quite maternal for a mere cousin." He reached the bank and halted his horse just a few feet from hers. "One might almost think you had a more personal stake in the Hayes family's welfare." Rebecca's skin crawled at his proximity, but she held her ground. "What do you want, Mr. Walton? Or should I call you by your real name, Thomas Richardson?" If he was surprised by her knowledge, he hid it well. Only a slight narrowing of his eyes betrayed any reaction. "Mason's been talking, I see. How unfortunate. I'd hoped we might conduct our business without such complications." "There is no business between you and the Hayes family," Rebecca countered. "Only a tragedy you may have had a hand in." Richardson laughed, the sound chilling in its genuine amusement. "Is that what Mason believes, that I killed his fragile wife? How dramatic." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping. "Eleanor Hayes was unstable long before I arrived in Silver Pine, Miss Walker. Whatever demons drove her to that barn rope were entirely her own." "Then why are you here?" Rebecca demanded. "Why follow us from town?" "Curiosity," Richardson replied smoothly. "I find myself intrigued by a woman who appears from nowhere, inserts herself into a grieving household, and claims familial ties that no one in town has ever heard mentioned." His blue eyes bored into hers. "Who are you really, Rebecca Walker? Or should I call you by your real name?" The blood drained from Rebecca's face. Could he know? Had he somehow connected her to William Watson? Richardson smiled at her reaction. "Secrets are dangerous things, Miss Walker, especially in these remote parts. Accidents happen. People disappear." He straightened in his saddle. "Give Mason a message from me. Tell him I know what Eleanor found in Denver. Tell him I know where she hid the evidence. And tell him, if he wants his daughters to grow up with a father, he'll bring it to me within 3 days." With that, he wheeled his horse around and splashed back across the creek, leaving Rebecca trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. She watched until he disappeared from view before turning her mule toward the trail Victoria had taken. The ride back to the ranch seemed interminable, each rustling branch or distant sound setting Rebecca's nerves on edge. When the familiar outlines of the Hayes property finally came into view, relief washed over her so strongly she felt lightheaded. Mason was in the yard, rifle in hand, Victoria at his side. When he spotted Rebecca emerging from the trees, his rigid posture relaxed marginally, though the weapon remained ready. "Are you hurt?" he called as she approached. Rebecca shook her head, dismounting on unsteady legs. "No, just shaken." Mason's jaw tightened as he scanned the tree line behind her. "Victoria said Walton followed you from town." "He did," Rebecca confirmed, accepting Mason's steadying hand on her elbow as they walked toward the house. "He wanted me to give you a message." Inside, with the doors secured and the girls settled in the kitchen with warm milk and bread, Rebecca recounted her encounter with Richardson, including his threat and the 3-day ultimatum. Mason listened in grim silence, his expression growing darker with each word. When she finished, he rose from the table and began pacing the small room, his movements tightly controlled but radiating tension. "He's bluffing," he finally said. "If he knew where Eleanor had hidden anything, he wouldn't need to threaten us. He would have taken it already." "Unless what she hid is something only you would recognize," Rebecca suggested, "or something hidden in a place only you can access." Mason's steps faltered, his gaze moving unconsciously toward the ceiling, toward Eleanor's locked room upstairs. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but I've searched that room 100 times since she died. There's nothing there but memories." "Are you certain?" Rebecca pressed gently. "Eleanor was clever from everything you've told me. If she wanted to hide something from everyone, even you, she might have been very creative about where she placed it." Mason ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "I've looked everywhere. Every floorboard, every hidden compartment in her escritoire, every seam in her dresses." "What about outside the room?" Rebecca suggested. "The hiding place Victoria and I found with the handkerchief, maybe there are others." A thoughtful expression crossed Mason's face. "Possibly," he conceded. "Eleanor knew every inch of this house. She could have hidden something anywhere." "Then we need to search again," Rebecca decided. "Everywhere, starting with her room." Mason's expression closed. "No," he said firmly. "That room stays locked. I'll search it again myself tonight." Rebecca recognized the futility of arguing the point. Mason guarded Eleanor's sanctuary jealously, the key a constant presence on his watch chain. Instead, she shifted focus to a more immediate concern. What about Richardson's threat? 3 days isn't much time. Mason's face hardened into resolve. "Richardson won't touch this family," he stated with quiet certainty. "I've dealt with his kind before. Men who hide behind threats and intimidation, but balk at direct confrontation." "He seemed quite capable of violence," Rebecca observed, remembering the cold calculation in those blue eyes. "So am I," Mason replied simply. "When it comes to protecting my own." The matter-of-fact declaration should have been chilling. Instead, Rebecca found it oddly comforting, the absolute certainty that Mason Hayes would do whatever was necessary to keep his family safe. A family that she realized with a start now included her. Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Rebecca found Mason on the porch, his rifle across his knees, as he stared into the darkness. She settled beside him on the rough-hewn bench, drawing her shawl tighter against the night chill. "You should rest," Mason said without looking at her. "It's been a difficult day." "So should you," Rebecca countered gently. "You can't stay awake every night, standing guard." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Done it before. Can do it again." They sat in companionable silence for a time, the night sounds of the prairie a soothing backdrop to their vigil. Finally, Rebecca gathered her courage and spoke the words that had been building in her since her conversation with Ezekiel. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her heart racing, "about why I'm here, about who I really am." Mason turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "I'm listening." Rebecca took a deep breath. "My mother's name was Margaret Hayes Watson. She was your half-sister." The statement hung in the night air between them, momentous and irreversible. Mason went utterly still, his face frozen in shock. "Margaret," he repeated the name, a whisper on his lips. "My sister, Margaret." Rebecca nodded. "She died when I was 12. I always was told it was suicide." Her voice caught. "But now, I'm not so certain." Mason's gaze hadn't left her face, studying her features with new intensity. "Rose's eyes," he murmured, almost to himself. "I should have seen it." "I didn't know," Rebecca hurried to explain, "about any of this, about you being my uncle. I didn't even know my mother had a brother until Ezekiel told me." "Ezekiel?" Mason echoed, something hardening in his tone. He knew this. For how long? He suspected from the beginning, Rebecca admitted. "Confirmed it when he saw my mother's cross." She touched the silver pendant at her throat. "He gave it to her on her 16th birthday." Mason was silent for a long moment, processing this revelation. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I was afraid." Rebecca answered honestly. "Afraid you wouldn't believe me, or would think I was trying to take advantage somehow. And then, with everything happening with Richardson, it never seemed the right time. And now," Mason's voice was carefully neutral, "why tell me now?" Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Because if we're going to face whatever's coming, we should do it honestly, as family." Something shifted in Mason's expression, surprise, perhaps, or a softening of his habitual guardedness. He reached out his calloused fingers, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, the gesture tentative, but unmistakably tender. "Family," he repeated the word, carrying a weight of meaning. "I thought I'd lost all of mine, except the girls." "You haven't," Rebecca said simply. "I'm here." For a brief moment, the walls Mason had built around himself seemed to waver, vulnerability flashing in his eyes, his hand still warm against her cheek. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. He withdrew his touch, his expression returning to its usual reserve, though something had changed between them, something fundamental and irrevocable. "Get some rest," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "Tomorrow we search the house from top to bottom. If Eleanor hid something, we're going to find it." Rebecca nodded, recognizing the dismissal. As she rose to go inside, Mason spoke once more, his words stopping her at the door. "Rebecca." She turned, looking back at him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for telling me the truth, for being here, for—" He gestured vaguely, seemingly at a loss for words. "For everything." The simple gratitude offered with such uncharacteristic openness touched Rebecca deeply. "You're welcome," she replied softly, and slipped inside, leaving Mason to his solitary watch. Upstairs, she paused to check on the girls. Victoria and Grace slept peacefully, untroubled by the dangers gathering around their family. Rebecca stood in the doorway, watching their gentle breathing, a fierce protectiveness welling within her. Family. After years of having none, or worse, having the twisted version William Watson had forced upon her, she had found her true kin. The knowledge settled in her chest like a warm coal, giving off a steady heat that felt dangerously close to hope. Outside, the moon rose over the distant hills, casting silver light across the land that had belonged to the Hayes family for generations. Her family. Rebecca realized with wonder. Her heritage as much as Mason's or the girls'. In the shadows near the barn, a figure moved Mason, making his rounds rifle ready, eternally vigilant. In 3 days, Richardson would come for whatever answer Mason could provide. In 3 days, the fragile peace they had built might shatter. But tonight, for this moment, they were safe. They were together. They were family. For Rebecca, who had known so little safety or belonging in her life, it was enough. Dawn found Rebecca already at work in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. She had slept poorly, her dreams haunted by Richardson's cold eyes, and William Watson's cruel hands, the two men blurring together in her subconscious, until they became a single malevolent presence, stalking her through endless corridors. The familiar rhythm of bread-making soothed her frayed nerves, the pushing and folding, the floury dust catching sunlight from the window, the yeasty smell promising sustenance and home. When Mason entered, she was already shaping the dough into loaves, her movements practiced and sure. "You're up early," he observed, moving to the stove where coffee percolated. "Couldn't sleep," Rebecca admitted, not looking up from her task. Mason poured himself a cup of coffee, studying her over the rim as he sipped. His gaze held a new awareness, a recalibration of their relationship in light of her revelation. "About last night," he began. "We don't need to discuss it further," Rebecca interrupted, suddenly afraid of what he might say. Perhaps in the cold light of morning he regretted his moment of vulnerability, his acceptance of her claim to kinship. "Yes, we do," Mason countered gently. "I've been thinking about what you told me. About Margaret. About you being my niece." He set down his cup, his expression serious. "It explains a great deal." Rebecca paused in her work hands, stilling in the dough. "What do you mean? Why you were able to connect with the girls so quickly? Why Grace took to you immediately? Why—" He hesitated, seeming to search for words. "Why everything feels different with you here." Rebecca's heart quickened at the simple admission. "Different how?" Mason's gaze dropped to his coffee cup, a hint of color touching his cheeks, an unexpected show of discomfort from a man usually so composed. "Better," he said finally. "Lighter, somehow. As if the house can breathe again." Before Rebecca could respond to this surprising confession, Grace's small voice interrupted from the doorway. "Mama Rose?" Both adults turned to find the little girl standing there in her nightgown, her dark hair tousled from sleep, clutching her rag doll by one arm. "Good morning, sweetheart." Rebecca smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you sleep well?" Grace nodded solemnly, then pointed toward the window. "Mama Rose," she repeated with more emphasis. Rebecca and Mason exchanged a puzzled glance. "What does she mean?" Rebecca asked quietly. Mason shook his head, baffled. "I'm not sure. She sometimes mixes up words still." Grace, clearly frustrated by their lack of understanding, stamped her small foot. "Outside," she insisted. "Mama Rose, in garden." "The garden?" Rebecca echoed, sudden understanding dawning. "She wants to show us something in the garden." Grace nodded vigorously, already turning toward the back door. "Come," she urged. "See?" They followed the child outside through the kitchen garden with its neat rows of vegetables, past the clothesline where sheets flapped in the morning breeze, toward a small, neglected plot at the edge of the yard. Here, tangled weeds had overtaken what was once clearly a flower garden, choking out whatever had been planted there. But in the center of the chaos, a single rosebush had survived, gnarled and untended, yet somehow thriving. And on it, A single perfect bloom had opened overnight, its petals a deep velvety red against the surrounding wilderness. "Mama Rose," Grace said with satisfaction, pointing to the flower. "She planted." Mason's breath caught audibly. "Eleanor's rose," he murmured. "I'd forgotten it was even here." "She loved roses," Victoria said from behind them, having joined the group unnoticed. "She brought this one from Denver, dug it up the night we left, said it was special, a family heirloom." Rebecca felt a strange prickling at the back of her neck. Not fear this time, but a sense of significance of pieces falling into place. "A family heirloom," she repeated slowly. "Mason, did Eleanor ever mention where this rose came from originally?" Mason stared at the flower, his expression distant with memory. "She said it had been in her mother's garden, and her grandmother's before that." His brow furrowed. "She called it, what was it, Rose de Morgan, I think. Said it was named for an ancestor." Rose de Morgan. Rebecca echoed the name, triggering a connection in her mind. "R.M. Rose Morgan, your mother's name before she married your father." Mason looked at her sharply. "Yes, but what does—" He broke off, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The handkerchief you found. R.M. You think there's a connection?" "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "But it seems like too much coincidence, doesn't it? The handkerchief hidden near Eleanor's room. The rose she insisted on bringing from Denver. Both connected to Rose Morgan." "Look," Victoria interrupted, pointing at the base of the rose bush, where the gnarled roots emerged from the soil. "There's something there." Mason knelt, pushing aside the weeds to reveal what had caught his daughter's attention. A small corner of metal protruded from the dirt, tarnished nearly the same color as the soil, but unmistakably man-made. "What is it, Papa?" Victoria asked, crowding close as Mason carefully began excavating around the object. Gradually, a small tin box emerged from the earth, a simple container about 6 inches square, its surface corroded by years underground. With great care, Mason lifted it free, brushing away clinging soil. "It's locked," he observed, indicating a small keyhole in the front. Rebecca's mind raced back to the day she'd found the handkerchief in the hidden compartment near Eleanor's room. There had been something else there, something small and metallic, that she'd widely dismissed as unimportant in her excitement over the fabric. "The key," she said suddenly. "I think I know where it is." She hurried back to the house, the others following close behind. Upstairs, she knelt before the loose panel in the wainscoting, pressing it until it popped open to reveal the small hidden compartment. The handkerchief was gone. She'd kept it in her own room, but there, nestled in the back corner, lay a small brass key. "This must be it," she said, retrieving it, and returning downstairs where the family waited around the kitchen table, the mysterious box centered between them. Mason took the key with steady fingers and inserted it into the lock. It turned with a rusty click, the lid lifting to reveal the box's contents, a small leather-bound journal, and a folded packet of papers tied with faded ribbon. "Eleanor's journal," Mason breathed, lifting it reverently. "I thought she'd stopped writing after Grace was born." "What are the papers?" Victoria asked, peering at the packet curiously. Mason untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the top document. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. "Bank records," he said, voice tight with suppressed emotion. "From the First National Bank of Denver. Transaction logs, account numbers." He looked up, meeting Rebecca's gaze. "This is it. This is what Eleanor found proof of the fraud she uncovered. Names, dates, amounts, everything needed to expose the entire operation." "And the people behind it," Rebecca guessed, understanding the significance. "Including Richardson." Mason nodded grimly. His name is all over these documents, along with several powerful men in the railroad business. He carefully refolded the papers, his expression hardening into resolve. This is what he's been searching for, what he threatened us to obtain. "What will you do?" Rebecca asked. Mason's gaze moved from her to his daughters, then back to the damning documents. "What Eleanor would have wanted," he said finally. "Take these to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. Let justice be done, whatever the cost." "The cost could be high," Rebecca warned, thinking of Richardson's cold eyes, his casual threat. "I know," Mason acknowledged, "which is why I need to ask something of you. Something I have no right to ask, but must." "Anything?" Rebecca responded without hesitation. "If something happens to me," Mason said carefully, mindful of the girls listening, "I need to know they'll be safe, that they'll be with family who loves them." "Nothing will happen to you," Rebecca insisted, her heart constricting at the very thought. "We'll face this together." Mason's blue eyes held hers, filled with a complex mixture of emotions. "Together," he agreed softly. "As family." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with new meaning, new promise. Victoria and Grace watched this exchange with solemn eyes, somehow understanding its significance despite their youth. Outside, the single red rose bloomed in the morning light, a splash of vibrant color against the wild tangle of the abandoned garden. Eleanor's rose, Rose Morgan's namesake, a family heirloom connecting past to present secrets to revelations, danger to hope. Whatever came in the days ahead, whatever confrontation awaited with Richardson, they would face it not as isolated individuals, but as a family bound by blood choice and newfound trust. The realization settled in Rebecca's chest, warm and certain she had found her home at last in this unlikely place with these wounded souls, who were somehow healing her as much as she was healing them. For now, it was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own dangers. But today, they had found Eleanor's secret. Today, they were together. Today, they were family. Here's the trimmed version of your story reduced to approximately 7,000 words, while preserving the core narrative. Dawn broke with bands of crimson slashing the eastern sky. "Red sky at morning, sailors take warning," Rebecca murmured, watching the sunrise from the kitchen window. Behind her, Mason secured Eleanor's documents in an oilcloth packet. "The storm will hold until afternoon," he said, his voice tight. "Enough time for you to reach town and for the deputy to get a good start toward Cheyenne." Rebecca turned from the window. "And enough time for Richardson to follow you into the western hills." Mason finished tying the packet and handed it to Rebecca. Their fingers brushed, lingering for a heartbeat. "The creek path to town," he reminded her. "Stay out of sight. Don't trust anyone but Cooper." Rebecca nodded, tucking the packet into her saddlebag alongside everyday supplies, flour, coffee, a few apples, innocent items to disguise her true mission should she be stopped. "And you," she asked, "what's your plan if Richardson catches up to you?" A muscle tightened in Mason's jaw. "I know those hills better than any man alive. I'll lead him in circles until you're safely back." They both knew it wasn't that simple. Thomas Richardson wasn't a man who took kindly to being misled, and he wouldn't be alone. The men he'd brought with him to Silver Pine, rough characters with hard eyes and holstered weapons, would follow Mason's trail as doggedly as bloodhounds. "1 hour," Mason said, glancing at the clock. "I leave first, making sure I'm seen heading west. You follow along the creek path once you're certain I've drawn him away." Rebecca nodded. "The girls are safe with Ezekiel." "Safe as can be," Mason confirmed. "His place is a fortress when it needs to be." Mason moved to the window, scanning the horizon. "It's time," he said quietly. "If I delay any longer, Richardson might split his men, leave someone to watch the ranch." Rebecca followed him to the door, words suddenly insufficient. Mason paused at the threshold, turning back to her. His weathered face, usually so guarded, now revealed vulnerability. "Rebecca," he began, her name rough in his throat. "If I don't—" "Don't," she interrupted, laying her fingers gently against his lips. "No farewells. We'll both return safely. We'll find Eleanor's justice. We'll build a life from these broken pieces." Something shifted in Mason's eyes, surprise, wonder, acknowledgement of what they'd both been circling. Then, with a suddenness that stole her breath, he pulled her into his arms. His mouth found hers in a kiss both desperate and tender, a declaration without words. When they broke apart, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "That wasn't how I planned to do that," he confessed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm not complaining," Rebecca replied softly. Mason's expression sobered. "Be safe," he said simply. "Remember your promise. At the first sign of trouble—" "Save myself," Rebecca finished. "I remember." He nodded once, then strode to his waiting horse. Rebecca watched as he rode west, his figure gradually diminishing against the blood-red sky. Only when he disappeared over the distant rise did she close the door, allowing her composed facade to crack just for a moment. Faith through the storm, she reminded herself, touching the silver cross at her throat. The Hayes family motto had never seemed more apt. Rebecca left precisely 1 hour later, following the creek path as planned. The route was longer than the main road, but offered cover stands of cottonwood and willow, natural dips in the terrain that kept rider and mount concealed. She'd traveled perhaps 2 miles when a sound stopped her cold hoofbeats approaching from behind. Heart racing, she guided her mule into a thicket of willows. The hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed. Through gaps in the branches, Rebecca glimpsed a rider. Sheriff Cooper, his silver star catching the morning light. "Miss Walker," he called softly. "It's Cooper. Ezekiel sent me to find you." Rebecca hesitated. "How did you know I'd be here?" "Ezekiel mentioned the creek path," Cooper replied. "Said Mason wanted to keep you off the main road." "And where is Mason now?" Cooper shifted in his saddle. "Headed west, last I saw. Had at least 2 riders following at a distance, Richardson's men, I'd guess." Rebecca nudged her mule forward. "I didn't expect an escort." Cooper's face was grave beneath his hat. "Change of plans. Richardson brought more men to town yesterday, hard cases from Denver. Thought you might need protection." As Rebecca drew alongside the sheriff, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A man on the ridge, partially concealed by a stunted pine. Sunlight glinted off something in his hands. "Field glasses." "Sheriff," she said carefully, "we're being watched." Cooper didn't turn, but his hand dropped to his holstered revolver. "Ridgeline." Rebecca nodded slightly. "1 man at least." "Probably more," Cooper muttered. "We need to move. Stay close." They continued along the creek, maintaining a steady pace. When they rounded a bend, Cooper gestured toward a narrow trail. "This way," he said urgently. "Cuts through the ridge, comes out behind town, less exposed." Rebecca followed as the trail climbed through rocky terrain. "Richardson's men have been watching the ranch since dawn," the sheriff explained. "When Mason rode out, 2 followed immediately, but at least 1 stayed back. They want those documents." "How many men does Richardson have?" Rebecca asked. Cooper's expression darkened. "5 that I've counted. Professionals by the look of them." They crested the ridge the town of Silver Pine nestled below. The town appeared peaceful church spire, gleaming wispy smoke rising from chimneys. "Almost there," Cooper said. "My deputy's waiting with fresh horses. The documents will be on their way to Cheyenne within the hour." Rebecca patted her saddlebag where Eleanor's evidence lay hidden. "And Richardson, last I saw he was headed west himself, following Hayes. That's what worries me. Richardson isn't a man who likes getting his hands dirty. If he's joining the hunt personally—" They reached the outskirts of town, Cooper leading them through back alleys. The jail came into view, a squat, sturdy building set slightly apart. A young deputy waited behind it with 3 saddled horses. Cooper noted her questioning glance. "One's for you," he explained. "Fresh mount for the return journey." The deputy Miller was perhaps 25, with a serious face and alert eyes. "All quiet, Sheriff," he reported. Rebecca dismounted, retrieving Eleanor's packet. "These need to reach Marshal Hardin in Cheyenne," she said, handing them to Miller. "No one else." The deputy nodded, tucking the packet inside his coat. "I'll guard them with my life, ma'am." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Cooper said. "Now ride, and don't stop until you reach Cheyenne." As Miller rode eastward, Rebecca felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension. The documents were on their way, yet the most dangerous part of their plan was still unfolding in the western hills, where Mason rode alone, pursued by Richardson. Cooper escorted her into the jail's back room, where his wife Sarah waited. "You'll wait here until we're certain it's safe for you to return," he said. "Sarah will keep you company while I patrol the town." Though she doubted sleep would come, Rebecca settled on a small cot, allowing her tense muscles to gradually relax. She drifted into a light doze. She woke at the sound of raised voices. The light through the small window had shifted, suggesting early afternoon. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face tight with concern. "Rebecca Daniels back. There's news." Heart pounding, Rebecca followed her where Cooper stood with one of the town's livery hands. The sheriff's expression sent a chill through her before he even spoke. "Richardson's men were seen returning to town an hour ago," he said without preamble, "riding hard from the west. No sign of Hayes with them." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. "Mason—" "We don't know anything for certain," Cooper cautioned. "Could be they lost his trail. Could be he's doubled back by another route. Or they could have him," Rebecca said, voicing her deepest fear. "We need to find out." Cooper's expression was grave. "I've sent men to watch the saloon, where Richardson's crew has been staying. If they've taken Hayes prisoner, that's where they'll hold him. And if they haven't, if Mason's hurt somewhere in those hills—" Cooper exchanged a look with his wife. "We'll organize a search party, but carefully. If Richardson gets wind that we're looking for Hayes—" Rebecca nodded. "How long until we know something?" "A few hours at least," Cooper replied. "My men will report back at sunset." A few hours, an eternity when someone you cared for might be in danger. "I need to return to the ranch," she said suddenly. "The girls might have heard something, and if Mason managed to get back there—" Cooper looked skeptical. "It's not safe, Rebecca." "I'll be careful," she insisted. "Take the creek path back, stay out of sight." A reluctant nod from the sheriff. "I'll have a fresh horse saddled for you. But promise me you'll head straight to the ranch. No detours, no heroics." Within 20 minutes, she was riding out of town on a sturdy chestnut mare. The afternoon had grown heavy with approaching weather, dark clouds building in the west. Faith through the storm, she reminded herself. They had come too far, risked too much to falter now. The Hayes Ranch appeared deserted. No smoke from the chimney, no movement in the yard. Inside the cabin was just as they'd left it that morning, breakfast dishes still on the table. Mason's coffee cup half full and cold. Through the window, she noticed dark clouds dominating the western sky. The storm was approaching faster than expected, thunder already grumbling. A noise from outside interrupted her hoofbeats approaching. Heart racing, Rebecca moved to the window, hoping it might be Mason. Instead, she saw Thomas Richardson riding into the yard alone. He dismounted with casual grace, tethering his horse to the porch rail as if he were an expected guest. His usually immaculate appearance was somewhat disheveled dust coating his dark suit, his hat brim bent from hard riding. Steeling herself, she opened the front door just as Richardson raised his hand to knock. He blinked in momentary surprise, then recovered with a cold smile. "Miss Walker," he greeted, tipping his hat. "How convenient! I was hoping to find you here." "Where is Mason?" Rebecca demanded. Richardson studied her with unnerving blue eyes. "Direct, aren't you? I appreciate that quality in a woman." He glanced past her into the cabin. "May I come in? The weather is turning rather dramatic." When Rebecca didn't move, his smile tightened. "I'm not here to harm you, Miss Walker. Quite the contrary. I have a proposition that might benefit us both." "I'm not interested in propositions," Rebecca replied coldly. "I want to know where Mason Hayes is." Richardson sighed theatrically. "Very well. Mr. Hayes is currently enjoying the hospitality of an acquaintance of mine at the old Silverton mine. He's unharmed mostly, though I can't promise that condition will persist indefinitely." He checked his pocket watch. "In fact, his continued well-being depends on the next few hours and the decisions you make." "What do you want?" "The documents, of course," Richardson replied. "Eleanor Hayes's little collection of banking records and transaction logs. I know Hayes had them. I know he wouldn't have destroyed them. Therefore, they must be hidden somewhere only he, or perhaps now, you would know to look." Rebecca's mind raced. Richardson didn't know the documents were already on their way to Cheyenne. That gave her an advantage. "And if I could produce these documents?" she asked carefully. Richardson's smile widened. "Then Mr. Hayes would be released unharmed. You have my word as a gentleman." "Your word?" Rebecca echoed skeptically. He spread his hands. "I'm a businessman, Miss Walker. I deal in transactions, not vendettas. Hayes means nothing to me personally. It's the documents I want, or more precisely, that my employers want." Rebecca considered her options. Play along, she decided. Gain time. "The documents aren't here," she said finally. "They're hidden elsewhere." "I assumed as much." Richardson nodded as, "Can you retrieve them?" "Yes," Rebecca lied, "but I'll need time." Richardson consulted his watch again. "You have until midnight. After that, my associate loses patience." His voice hardened, and he can be most unpleasant when patience fails him. "This associate," she probed, "does he have a name?" Something calculating entered Richardson's gaze. "He's expressed particular interest in meeting you, actually. Says you're an old acquaintance." He paused deliberately. "His name is Watson, William Watson, Jr." The name hit Rebecca like a physical blow, memories of terror flooding back. William, here, working with Richardson. "Ah, I see you remember him," Richardson smiled. "He certainly remembers you, speaks quite possessively. Something about a wife who ran away." Rebecca's hand rose unconsciously to her throat, where beneath her collar lay the branded W. Williams mark. "He is not my husband," she stated. "Not in any way that matters." "Legally, I believe he is," Richardson countered. "But that's between you and him. My interest remains purely professional." The documents, Miss Walker. Midnight. The old Silverton mine. He tipped his hat again. "I trust you remember the way "I'll find it," she said coldly. "Excellent." Richardson mounted with fluid grace. "Oh, and Miss Walker. Come alone. Any sign of the sheriff or his men, and Hayes pays the price." His smile never reached his eyes. "As will you when Watson finally gets his hands on you." With that parting threat, he rode away. The moment he disappeared, Rebecca closed the door and leaned against it, allowing herself a moment of terror. William. The name sent phantom pain through the brand on her neck. But Mason was in their hands, Mason who had given her shelter when she had nowhere else to go. Mason who had trusted her with his daughters. Mason who just hours ago had kissed her with a tenderness that made her believe in second chances. She had until midnight to devise a plan. Richardson expected her to bring documents that were already on their way to Cheyenne. She would have to bluff to create some facsimile that might pass inspection in the dim light of the mine. And she would need help. Not Cooper Richardson would be watching for official involvement. But there was one person who knew the land better than anyone, who had connections throughout the territory, who had already proven his willingness to fight for the Hayes family. Ezekiel. Decision made, Rebecca gathered necessities: Mason's spare revolver ammunition, a canteen of water, a small knife that she slipped into her boot. Outside, thunder rumbled closer, the first heavy drops of rain beginning to fall as she mounted the chestnut mare and set off toward Ezekiel's property. The storm was breaking in earnest, but Rebecca rode steadily through it, determination overriding fear. The old Silverton mine loomed against the storm-darkened sky, its weathered timbers stark silhouettes, illuminated by lightning. Rebecca and Ezekiel surveyed it from a pine thicket, a quarter-mile distant, rain dripping from their hats. "2 horses outside the main entrance," Ezekiel murmured, "and a light inside. See it?" Rebecca nodded. "Mason's Bay isn't there. Could be hidden inside," Ezekiel suggested. "Or they might have—" He trailed off. "He's alive," Rebecca stated firmly. "Richardson wants those documents too badly to kill his only leverage." Ezekiel checked his rifle to ensure the powder had stayed dry. "Plan's simple enough. I create a distraction at the main entrance. You slip in through that side shaft there." He pointed to a smaller opening. "Find Hayes, get him out. I'll keep them busy as long as I can." The plan was simple, perhaps too simple. But time was running short, the midnight deadline less than an hour away. "Remember," Ezekiel added, "Watson's in there too, your husband." "He was never my husband in any way that matters," Rebecca replied. "Just a man who bought me from my father and thought that made me his property." They separated, Ezekiel circling toward the main entrance, while Rebecca worked her way down the slope toward the side shaft. The footing was treacherous, loose shale slick with rain. She moved slowly, each step carefully placed. At the side entrance, Rebecca paused, listening. From within came the faint sound of voices. The packet she carried carefully prepared pages of meaningless numbers and names designed to resemble banking records in dim light felt heavy in her pocket. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca stepped into the tunnel, feeling her way forward in near total darkness. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of wet stone and old timber. As she progressed, the voices grew gradually louder, accompanied by a faint glow of light reflecting off the walls ahead. Pressing herself against the stone wall, she peered around the corner. The chamber was illuminated by several lanterns. In the center, tied to a support beam, sat Mason Hayes. His face was bloodied, one eye swollen shut, his shirt torn and stained with what could only be more blood. Despite his injuries, he sat upright, his expression defiant. William Watson Jr. hadn't changed much in the 6 months since Rebecca had fled his household. Still handsome in a conventional way, With clean-cut features and expensive tailoring, he exuded the same cold authority that had terrorized her for years. "Your stubbornness is becoming tiresome, Hayes," William was saying. "Simply tell us where the documents are, and this unpleasantness can end." Mason spat blood onto the dirt floor. "Go to hell," he replied, his voice hoarse but steady. William sighed theatrically, then nodded to someone outside Rebecca's limited field of vision. A moment later, Thomas Richardson stepped into view, rolling up his sleeves. "Perhaps you need further motivation," Richardson suggested conversationally. "Your daughters, for instance. Lovely children, I'm told. The younger one has your eyes." Mason lunged against his restraints. "Touch them and I'll kill you," he growled. "Slowly," Richardson chuckled. "Brave words from a man in your position." He crouched before Mason. "Tell us where you've hidden Eleanor's evidence, and your family remains unharmed. Continue this pointless resistance and—" He shrugged. "The documents are gone," Mason stated flatly. "Already on their way to the federal marshal in Cheyenne." Richardson's expression hardened. "You're lying," he hissed. "You wouldn't trust such valuable leverage to a courier. No, you've hidden them somewhere only you would find." "Now believe what you want," Mason replied with grim satisfaction. "But in a day or two, those bank records will be the talk of every newspaper from here to Denver. Your employers will hang Richardson, and you along with them." Richardson struck Mason across the face. "Who took them? Who carried the documents to Cheyenne?" Mason remained silent. Richardson grabbed him by the hair. "Was it the woman, your precious cousin, who appeared so conveniently when you needed help?" "Leave him, Richardson," William said dismissively. "He won't talk, not about the documents anyway." He stepped closer, studying Mason. "But perhaps he'll be more forthcoming about my wife, about Rebecca." Mason's expression betrayed nothing. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied evenly. William smiled. "Come now, Hayes. Let's not play games. I know Rebecca is staying at your ranch. I know she's been caring for your daughters. What I don't know is where she is at this precise moment." "Far from here," Mason answered, his voice hardening. "Somewhere you'll never find her." "Oh, I'll find her," William assured him. "Rebecca belongs to me. She always has. The law recognizes our marriage, and a husband has certain rights over his wayward wife." Mason's jaw tightened. "No man owns another human being," he stated flatly. "Rebecca is free to choose her own path." William laughed coldly. "How quaint. You fancy yourself her protector, don't you? Her white knight." He leaned closer. "Did she show you my mark? The brand I placed on her lovely throat. Adieu for Watson. A reminder that she is my property no matter how far she runs." Mason lunged forward with such violence that the wooden beam creaked in protest. "You'll never touch her again," he growled. "I'll die before I let that happen." "That," William replied with a cold smile, "can certainly be arranged." From her hiding place, Rebecca felt sick. The casual cruelty in William's voice brought back memories she'd fought to suppress. Yet, alongside the fear, a new emotion was growing: rage. Pure, cleansing rage at what these men had done to Mason, what they threatened to do to the girls, what William had done to her for years. A sudden explosion from the main entrance shattered the scene, Ezekiel's distraction right on schedule. All three men whirled toward the sound. "What the devil?" Richardson began, then barked orders. "Check it now!" Footsteps scrambled away, leaving only Richardson, William, and the bound Mason. Rebecca stepped into the open Mason's revolver, steady in her hand. "Step away from him!" she commanded, her voice far calmer than her racing heart. Both men froze, then slowly turned. William's face registered shock, then terrible pleasure. "Rebecca," he breathed. "How thoughtful of you to save me the trouble of hunting you down." "I said step away," Rebecca repeated, advancing into the chamber, the revolver trained at William's chest. "Both of you, move to that wall. Now." Richardson complied with smooth caution, hands raised slightly. William remained where he stood, his eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. "You won't shoot me," he said confidently. "You never could stand the sight of blood. Remember how you fainted when I gave you my mark." He touched his neck in the same spot where Rebecca's brand lay hidden. "Such a perfect moment watching you understand that you were truly mine." Mason strained against his restraints. "Rebecca, get out of here," he urged. "Forget me. Just go." "Not without you," she replied. A second explosion rocked the mine closer this time, sending dust and stones pattering from the ceiling. Ezekiel was escalating the distraction. Richardson's composure cracked. "This is pointless," he snapped. "The documents, Miss Walker. That's all we want. Give them to us, and we can all walk away." "The documents are gone," Rebecca stated flatly. "On their way to Cheyenne with a federal deputy. It's over, Richardson." "You're bluffing," William countered, though uncertainty crossed his features. Rebecca reached into her pocket, withdrawing the false packet. "These are copies," she lied. "Insurance in case anything happened to the originals." Richardson's eyes fixed on the packet with naked hunger. "Give them to me," he demanded. "After Mason is free," Rebecca countered. A standoff ensued. Then, deliberately, William withdrew a small derringer from his waistcoat pocket. "Enough games," he said coldly, aiming at Mason's head. "The documents. Now, or Hayes dies where he sits." Rebecca's finger tightened on the trigger of Mason's revolver, but she couldn't fire quickly enough to prevent William from shooting Mason at such close range. "All right," she said, appearing to relent. "Here." She tossed the packet toward Richardson, who snatched it from the air. As Richardson eagerly opened the packet, Rebecca moved closer to Mason. William maintained his aim at Mason's head, his attention divided. "Wait," Richardson said, suddenly rifling through the papers. "These are fake. Meaningless numbers, random names." He flung the papers aside, his composure shattering. "Where are the real documents?" "I told you," Rebecca replied, now beside Mason. "On their way to Cheyenne. These were just to get close enough to free Mason." She began working at Mason's restraints with her free hand, the revolver still trained on William. William's face contorted with rage. "You deceitful whore!" he snarled, swinging his derringer toward her. "I'll teach you what happens to wives who defy their husbands." "She's not your wife," came a new voice from the chamber entrance. "Not anymore." All heads turned to see Sheriff Cooper standing in the tunnel, opening his revolver trained on William. "Lower your weapon, Watson. It's over." For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. William's derringer pointed at Rebecca Cooper's revolver, aimed at William. Rebecca still frantically working at Mason's restraints. Then Richardson, seeing his opportunity, lunged toward the far exit. Cooper's attention flickered toward the movement, a split second of distraction that William seized upon. He fired the derringer's report, deafeningly loud. Rebecca felt something punch into her side, hot and searing. She stumbled, falling against Mason, vaguely aware of Cooper returning fire, of William crumpling to the ground, of Richardson disappearing into darkness. "Rebecca!" Mason's voice seemed distant. "Rebecca, stay with me." She tried to respond, but her mouth wouldn't form words. Darkness encroached at the edges of her vision, the pain in her side blooming outward. Through the gathering shadows, she felt Mason's restraints finally give way beneath her fingers. His arms came around her, as she slipped toward unconsciousness, his voice urgent. "Don't leave me, Rebecca. I love you. Do you hear me? I love you." Then darkness claimed her. Rebecca woke to the familiar scent of wood smoke and herbs, her body heavy with the dull ache of healing wounds. She opened her eyes to find herself in her own bed at the Hayes Ranch, sunlight streaming through the curtains. Beside the bed, head drooping in exhausted sleep, sat Mason. Relief flooded through her at the sight of him alive if battered. His face bore the marks of his ordeal, a blackened eye, a split lip, healing a new scar forming along his jawline. Yet even in sleep, one of his hands remained stretched toward the bed, fingers brushing the quilt near her own. "Mason," she whispered. His head snapped up instantly, sleep forgotten as his eyes found hers. For a moment, he simply stared as if unable to believe what he was seeing. "Rebecca!" He managed his voice rough. "You're awake!" "Water?" she croaked, and he moved immediately, helping her sit up, just enough to sip from the glass he held to her lips. The simple movement sent pain through her side. "How long?" she asked. 4 days, Mason replied gently, easing her back against the pillows. The doctor wasn't sure. "William," a shadow crossed Mason's face. "Dead. Cooper's bullet found its mark. Richardson got away." Mason admitted frustration evident. Cooper had men searching, but he's vanished. Probably halfway to Mexico by now. "The documents." A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "Reached Cheyenne safely. Federal agents have already arrested 2 bank directors and a judge in Denver. Richardson's employers are falling like dominoes." "Good," Rebecca murmured. "Eleanor would be pleased." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with all that had happened. Rebecca studied Mason's face, noting the exhaustion in every line. "The girls?" She asked the question, pressing most urgently. "Safe," Mason assured her. "Staying with Ezekiel until—" He hesitated. "Until we knew if you would recover." The simple statement conveyed the fear they had all lived with these past days, the possibility that Rebecca might not wake. "I promised Grace I'd bring her to see you the moment you opened your eyes," Mason continued. "She's been making you drawings, quite a collection by now." Rebecca smiled. "I look forward to seeing them." Another silence. This one charged with things unsaid. Rebecca gathered her courage. "In the mine," she began hesitantly, "when I was shot, you said," Mason's gaze held hers steadily, "that I love you." He finished, no hesitation now. "I do. I have for longer than I realized. Maybe since that first night in the storm when you stood on the church porch with nothing but courage and that silver cross to sustain you." The simple declaration brought tears to her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered, "for giving me a home when I had none, for trusting me with your daughters, for seeing me as I really am." Mason took her hand in his thumb tracing patterns across her palm. "When William shot you," he said, his voice dropping, "and I thought I might lose you before I ever really had you. I've never known fear like that, not even when Eleanor died." "I'm still here," she reminded him softly. "A little worse for wear, but healing." "We all are," Mason replied, a depth of meaning in the simple words. "The doctor says you'll need weeks of rest. No riding, no housework, no lifting the girls." Rebecca grimaced. "What about our wedding?" "Can wait," Mason interrupted gently. "We have time now, Rebecca, all the time we need." As if to prove his point, he leaned forward, pressing his lips to hers in a tender kiss, a promise of days to come. Epilogue. 20 years later, the old cabin had changed over the decades, expanded and improved as the Hayes family grew and prospered. A veranda now wrapped around three sides, shaded by climbing roses that perfumed the summer air. Behind the house, a magnificent rose garden bloomed in riotous color, the famous Hayes Rose Garden that visitors came from miles around to admire. Rebecca stood among her roses, carefully tending the original bush, Eleanor's Rose de Morgan, which still bloomed faithfully each year. At 47, silver threads now mingled with the rich brown of her hair, and the bullet wound in her side occasionally ached before storms, but her hands remained steady among the thorns. "Careful with that one," came Mason's voice. "It bit me yesterday." She turned with a smile as her husband approached. 20 years had silvered his hair, but his blue eyes remained as vibrant as ever. "The rose knows better than to bite me," Rebecca replied. "I'm the one who nursed it back from near death." Mason chuckled, his hand resting at the small of her back, a casual touch that still sent warmth through her. "The grandchildren are arriving soon," he reminded her. "Victoria sent word they've just left town." Victoria, now 27, and married to the local doctor, had 2 children of her own. Grace, at 23, was newly engaged to a young rancher from the next county, her once silent nature having blossomed into quiet confidence. "Happy anniversary," Rebecca said as they walked toward the house. Mason smiled down at her. 19 years, he mused. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that Reverend Wells pronounced us man and wife. Other times it feels like we've always been together." Rebecca finished, understanding perfectly. Their path to happiness hadn't always been smooth. The early years had brought challenges. Rebecca's lengthy recovery nightmares that plagued them both, the occasional flare of temper from 2 strong-willed individuals learning to build a life together. There had been sorrows, too, a baby lost, before it quickened Ezekiel's peaceful passing, the difficult year when drought nearly cost them the ranch. But through it all, they had held fast to each other and to the family they'd built. The love that had begun in desperation, a man needing a mother for his daughters, a woman needing shelter from the storm, had deepened into something profound and enduring. As they reached the porch, Mason drew Rebecca into his arms. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when I found you that night, I never imagined that we'd end up here," Rebecca supplied. "Sometimes the best journeys are the ones we never planned." From inside the house came the sound of a door opening, followed by Lucy's voice, their daughter, born a year after their wedding, now 18. "Ma Pa, Victoria's wagon is coming up the road." They separated, though Mason kept Rebecca's hand as they turned toward the house. "Coming," he called back. Together, they climbed the porch steps to welcome their growing family, the precious legacy they'd built from broken beginnings. Outside, Eleanor's rose continued its quiet blooming, a testament to endurance, to roots that run deep, to faith that sustains through every storm, and to love imperfect, challenging, but ultimately triumphant, that transforms strangers into family and houses into homes.